That was great. Thank you so much. Now it's my pleasure to welcome another friend of Food Tank. It's like all of my good friends are coming and just hanging out, and it makes me feel really excited. So I'm really thrilled to have Julie Kunen here from Oatly. She is the Director of Sustainability for North America, and she's someone I admire because she's been involved in so many different aspects of the food system, from academia to politics to to research to all of these different things. She's so knowledgeable about how things work and don't work. And so I'm so excited to have you here. And so, we had a long discussion about what we should entitle this panel. And so I'm wondering, if we can talk about, can companies regenerate agriculture? Is that even possible?
Is that a thing?
Is that a thing? I don't know.
Yeah. I actually loved that you posed that question that way. And part of the reason I love it is because we got to be a little bit contrarian in our answer and say, well, no.
Yeah.
Which, you want me to say, sure, of course, and here's what we're going to do. And we'll talk about what we're going to do. The agriculture system, as every speaker that you've been hearing from this week, it's a complex and integrated and sort of interwoven system. I think companies have an essential role to play, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about what Oatly is doing as part of that system. But because it's a system, every lever has to be moving. Mm-hmm. And there's policy pieces, and there's banking pieces, and there's agronomy and research pieces, and there's advocacy pieces, and then there's like market and consumer and the products that we make kinds of pieces. So we have that role to play, and this is a system that has to be moving towards transformation together. So,
absolutely.
It's either a no or it's a yes and.
Yeah, no, I think everything's a yes and. So what is Oatly doing on this front then?
Yeah, fantastic. So for folks who don't know, Oatly is the original plant milk company, oat milk company. We are striving to present a set of products to the world that are solutions to the climate crisis. So we recognize the world is in crisis. We recognize that the agricultural system is responsible for about a third of greenhouse gas emissions, and that it takes inordinate amounts of land and water and other resources on the planet. So people eat all the time and want to be able to make good, delicious choices with their foods. And so we're trying to present a food that is in itself a solution to the problem. We generally think that plant-based foods are, less resource-intensive than animal-based equivalents. So our whole modus operandi is to shift dairy consumption of cow milk to plant milk, and in doing so, save a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions. To do that, we want to be part of a regenerative farming system, and that's what we're working towards.
Why are oats special?
They're delicious. They're good for you. No, they have a lot of qualities. They're generally speaking a crop that's farmed without irrigation, so they're very water saving. They are generally speaking a crop that is grown without a lot of chemical inputs. They can be grown in many different ecosystems. So for example, here in North America, the market that I work in, we grow them either in the US or Canada. So we don't have to ship them all over the world. They don't come with that carbon footprint. And they're also a crop that works really, really well in rotation with other crops. And so, it's part of diversifying the cycle, breaking up pest cycles, contributing, in sort of soil and formation and water quality, but it's also providing farmers with other crop options and other markets. And that's a huge, the market piece for farmers and the economic viability of the system for farmers is a really key piece.
It's allowing farmers in a lot of ways to go back to the diverse systems we used to see 150 years ago.
Yeah, and even beyond that, and I think I need to acknowledge that, the original farmers on this planet, who were First Nations and other indigenous peoples, farmed in harmony with the planet, and they grew, in a vast diversity of crops. And I think we need to acknowledge that farmers of color, indigenous people, are the originators of what we're today calling regenerative farming.
Right.
So there's a recognition and a respect for the fact that, nature knows what it's doing, right? We broke up the soil with mechanized farming, with chemicals, with all these things. And there are ways to recover that by introducing diversity back into the system and lowering that load of chemicals and synthetic fossil fuel-based inputs.
Well, and lowering that diversity, you mentioned it before, also lowers the amount of pests and pathogens, which we talked about earlier today.
Yeah, I mean, I think you don't have to be an ecologist. I happen to have somewhat of a background in ecology. But I mean, everybody knows that if you grow all of the same thing at all of the same time, it's like the buffet for the pests, right? So you need to break up those systems and, kind of take out and give back different pieces because it's a very complex puzzle.
Absolutely. For someone with a strong academic and research background, I wonder that shift to the private sector must have been sort of like a switch you had to turn.
It's like a mind-blowing shift. Yeah, so I mean, as you alluded to, I started my career in academia. I worked in the federal government for a long time. I worked in nonprofit. I kind of came at food and sustainability from all these different perspectives. And for me, what I finally sort of concluded, and I think some of the earlier speakers talked about it, is, the market moves things, right? People's consumer choices and the market and the sort of capitalist economic framework that we live in is what drives change on this planet. And so I decided, for me personally, I wanted to go inside that beast and try to move things from inside. And to do that in a company that's mission driven to begin with, to me is a little bit the best of both worlds. So I think that a private sector company, and certainly a company like Oatly and our fellow alt food companies, has tremendous power and potential to make the changes that we all know that are needed.
Yeah, and we need to do them quickly. The urgency is there, and we can talk about that later. One of the things that I wanted to ask was, I think eaters and maybe people in this audience are confused about the term regenerative agriculture, and there are lots of different definitions out there. I'm wondering how Oatly and you define it, and are those things different?
Yeah, I mean, it's a contested topic, it's a contested term, and I do think that there is confusion because there is no consensus definition. It's still very much sort of a platform that is being debated and sort of crystallized in various kinds of language. We actually went through a 6 to 8 month long process of consulting with experts and going within our company and all of the different pieces that need to be involved, because there's farming, there's processing, there's manufacturing, our whole supply chain, for a bucket term. We took a very careful look at that, and then took a look at our own values as a company and said, okay, where are we coming out on this in terms of a definition for regenerative agriculture? So for us, we have committed to investing in regenerative systems that have 3 primary qualities. They're going to reduce overall net greenhouse gas emissions, they're going to improve ecosystem health, and they're going to support farm viability and resilience. So those are 3 kind of main buckets. I think they're really critical buckets. And if I can just maybe call out a couple of things specific to each of those is, in the net greenhouse gas emissions space, of course, there's a lot of talk about carbon and soil carbon. That is obviously critical. We are also taking a special look at the role of nitrogen and the role of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer over application as a leading cause of nitrous oxide emissions and a leading cause of nitrate sort of leaching into groundwater and soil, and seeing what we can do to invest in solutions that will minimize that. I think that's special in what Oatly is doing. I think on the ecosystem health side, again, we're very focused on water quality and the reduction of synthetic inputs that will sort of start to rebuild the quality of water and soils in the systems. And then I think the final piece that's really special is we've really thought a lot about what farmers would need from a company like Oatly. I heard one of the previous speakers talk about the fact that you don't just want to replicate the sort of commodity subsidy system that's gotten us to the place that we're in now, and I agree with that. So at the same time, we're asking farmers to take risks, to break up the system that they know and to experiment with it. We have to help support that risk. That's expensive and that's a risky proposition. It puts their insurance at risk, it puts their bank loans at risk. So we need to be part of helping to lower that risk level. And we're looking at ways, and I'm the first one to say we don't have an answer to this yet, but we're in conversation about this. We know that American farm families are aging out. We know that it's very, very difficult to pass a farm down from generation to generation. We'd like to be part of keeping farmland in farm families and supporting that intergenerational viability. How to do that exactly is something we are trying to co-create right now with our partners. So those are the special pieces, I think, of Oatly's definition.
Well, one of the things that I find so interesting about regenerative agriculture is that it's both a practice, and you talked about a lot of the practices, but it's also this philosophy. It's this different way of thinking, and you alluded to that. Can you talk about how we need to think about our food systems differently, especially right now? It's not just the pandemic. We have a biodiversity loss crisis, we have a climate crisis, we have a water crisis. All of these things are sort of coming to a head.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's probably because they're all kind of pieces of the same crisis, which is that we're not in harmony with the world, which sounds a little woo-woo. Like, we're not making use of the sort of systems attributes that characterize sort of the ecology and humans' relationship with people on the planet. Where we started was sort of with this term of sustainability, right? And I think that most people recognize now that, sustainable got us a certain way down that road.
Right.
But it's, sort of, that's like a do no harm principle. Like, don't mess it up.
Right.
And we're at the point now where that's not good enough, right?
Right.
I mean, so the concept of regeneration is, can we create something that's more holistic, that's more healthy, that's more positive, with whatever values you want to associate to that,
right,
than where we started before. And that is because we need this corrective action for the damage that's been done. That's
absolutely
how I think about it, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess that leads into my next question. So Oatly is a very special company in a lot of different ways, but how can other companies sort of follow this model, follow this lead? There's so much to learn from what you do, and what Oatly does. There's so much to learn from what some of the companies we've already heard from over South by, not just here, but at South by Southwest over this week and last. How can companies sort of take this on?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and thank you for saying that Oatly is a special company. I think so.
I think so.
But I think we are among the group of companies that is not, like, we're not a part of big food and trying to make what big food produces like slightly less bad.
Sure.
We're actually trying to make something that from out of the gate is a positive contribution to society, that is a solution to the problem. There are many companies like that. We all source ingredients, we all produce products, and we all sell those to consumers. So folks can easily, I think, and certain companies are taking on this model. But, even large companies that sometimes they're harder ships to steer. I think a lot of my colleagues in bigger food companies, Mars was mentioned earlier, are taking on aspects of working with farmers and working to sort of, promote systems that are going to work for them, but that are at the end of the day going to produce crops that the companies themselves can buy.
Right,
So.
and again, making farmers and farming a more viable, less risky occupation. I think that's a huge part of this. You mentioned farmers aging before. We want to make this an attractive, lifestyle for folks.
Yeah, I have a huge amount of respect. You know this about me personally. I, during the year of the pandemic, 2020, actually went and worked for 5 months as a farmhand on an organic farm, because I thought I need to understand how this food is being produced, and I want to be part of, producing healthy food for people in a moment of real food system crisis.
Right.
And it was, and I heard your colleague from Driscoll's say earlier, we need to stop thinking about farm work as unskilled labor. It's hugely skilled labor. I was bad at it. I tried really hard, and no amount of sort of goodwill and intent. I didn't have those skills. I have a huge amount of respect for people who do.
Yeah, no, I'm the same way. I've worked on farms, but I am not as good as farmers, and never will be. So I want to go back to how other companies can learn from you, and we've had a lot of conversations about a spirit of cooperation.
Yeah.
And do you think that's really possible?
I absolutely think it's possible. I think it's actively happening. I sit in a lot of pre-competitive, collaborations with like-minded companies, and I will say there is a communal spirit in those conversations that I was very pleasantly surprised to find. We talk all the time. We share sort of technical criteria. We share frameworks. We ask each other questions. It's a space really of openness and trust, and I think it's because there's a cadre of us working on sustainability in these spaces who are genuinely mission committed. Like, we really want to get this change done. So, we pull out the stops to help each other.
Yeah.
So I do. I think that that's a really doable thing.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what's driving what we're seeing right now in this cultural awareness of food systems, the idea that we can create more equitable food systems, which, 5 years ago, nobody was talking about that in quite the same way we are now. There were certain people, and I want to give my hat off to them, but in regular conversations, especially among white folks, and I just have to call it out, we were not concerned about the equity part of this.
Yeah. I can point to a lot of different things, and certainly, I think I'm one of those people that was thinking about this, a while ago. Food is just one of these things that people have very strong feelings, memories, emotions, associations to, and because of that, it's such a powerful tool. The whole reason I work in the food space is because I come out of the conservation side of the house. I was a biodiversity conservationist. I worked on natural resources. And I came to the conclusion that food was one of the most powerful tools that we had to have that conversation with people and to make it very, very clear to people what role they had to play in like a crisis in the Amazon or, whatever, overfishing in, the South Indian Ocean, whatever it is. I just think there is a power and a resonance in food that everybody feels, even if they're not actively thinking about it.
Right.
And what's changed, sort of more specifically to your question, I think that with the world in crises, plural, whether that's pandemic or war or, all the supply chain disruptions, people were forced to think about it in ways that they didn't before. And I think as soon as you pick your head up and start thinking about my food, why don't I have it? Is it good for me? How am I feeling? All these questions sort of surface. And then, you go down the rabbit hole and you find really interesting things.
It's a big rabbit hole, too. One of the questions I have is, I think about all kinds of farmers, and dairy farmers have really, really struggled over the last several years in the United States, and I'm sure other parts of the world, but I know more specifically about the United States. And I'm wondering, there's for a lot of dairy farmers, they want to transition to something else. They're not happy. They're not making enough money. They don't like how they have to treat cows, or they don't like being part of a commodity system. How can a company like Oatly, talk to a dairy farmer in a way that's non-confrontational and help them think about making a transition?
Yeah. I mean, that's a difficult question, so I'm glad that you're asking it, because let's not pretend that that's, not in the room with us. I mean, first I want to make clear that, our issue has never been with farmers. We see farmers as sort of enmeshed in a system that is not serving them. And our issue is with, big industrial dairy, right? Because it has all of these effects of concentrating animals and, we don't have to go through the litany of sort of negative impacts of that system. I think what I would say is, many of the farmers who grow oats also grow like feed for livestock, and they're, sort of diversified in what they grow. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be doing that.
Sure.
I think the conversation to have is, what does the farmer sort of want out of that experience? I was in Iowa a couple months ago at a farmer conference that was sponsored by one of our partners there, and so many of the farmers said to me, we love the fact that we are now growing food for people. It's really important to us that we know, like, there's a product on the shelf that I can show my family, I grew for this. I'm creating food that has this value.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's common ground among us, and we're just going to build on that common ground.
Yeah.
And, it's not going to be a 100% overlap, but I think it is very important just to restate that I think the agricultural system, particularly in this country, has not served those families well, and that needs to change so that they can actually farm the way that they know how to farm.
How can we change that? Why hasn't it served them? Why have we forgotten them?
I mean, if there was an easy answer, somebody would have said it already. I do think there are incentives in the system. There is, we know this, that back in the 50s, the sort of go big or go home kind of mentality took over. I think that has certainly, improved, at least in the short-term yield, at the expense of lots of other things. So I think the combination of government policy, financial incentives, the complexity of figuring out a more complex system and how you parse that out economically has all been really challenging. So I just think now we have tools that can handle that complexity in ways that we couldn't before, and we can work on it, sort of in a more integrated fashion.
That's such an important point, because I think in the past we've looked at things as like silver bullets, like, okay, a policy will fix this, a practice will fix this. Now we understand, and you started the conversation like this, we need this more holistic vision that incorporates all of those tool sets.
Yeah, I agree with you. But at the same time, I do think it's important to call out the specific things. Like, there are policies in place from the government that are perverse incentives, right?
Sure.
Like, fossil fuel is subsidized. These artificial sort of inputs are subsidized. Commodity crops are subsidized. Like, all of that is not accidental, right? Like, that's been there. That's part of the system. Those things need to change. And I think, we as a company have been saying for a while, like, it's not a level playing field for plant-based companies, and it's not a level playing field for farmers who want to farm that way. I think, that's something we can call out. But I also think, again, back to the reason we're having this conversation is, we're a company that wants to be part of that solution. So part of doing that is just creating markets, getting out there, having customers be more familiar with our product, and letting customers help drive the system through the choices that they're making.
Absolutely, absolutely. And a company like Oatly is showing up at places where policy decisions are being made. You were at COP26. I'm sure you'll be at COP27. You're in these debates, and I'm sure somebody with a sort of a government background is seeing things unfold that the rest of us aren't.
I mean, I think we feel like it's important to be in those conversations. We're a very small company. I mean, I have a team of 3 people. So it's not, I don't want anyone to imagine that we have this sort of massive, group of people. I think we're in those conversations because we think it's important for people to hear the voice that we think that we're raising. I do feel like between, COP maybe, but the UN food system, you and I had a conversation about the UN global food system. Things are moving. And I think that part of the reason things are moving is because companies like us are saying, you need to move faster.
Right.
Like, we want to be there. We want to be part of this. But like other pieces, particularly those policy pieces, they have to accelerate. So we're pushing that, and I think we're seeing some traction.
Let's talk about this urgency. I was on a panel recently with Julia Collins from Planet Forward, and she's like, we have 100 months to solve the climate crisis. There is a real urgency here. And I have a lot of hope. I have a lot of optimism. But there's a real urgency here. And can you talk about that? Because the private sector sometimes moves very fast, sometimes moves very slow.
Yeah. We are one of those companies that is trying to scale and grow as fast as we can. We've opened, I think, 3 new factories in the last year.
Wow.
We built factories in the middle of COVID, and we did it safely so that none of our employees were at risk. We have been, on a year-on-year sort of orders of magnitude growth trajectory, and that's intentional. Like, that is part of the impact mission. So, for us, our big sort of North Star is the conversion of dairy drinkers to oat, in our case. And we've sort of set a 2025 milestone for that of converting, I think it's 2.9 billion liters of dairy product to oat, which we estimate will save about 2.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. 2.9 billion liters of product converted away from dairy towards Oatly will save, we estimate, about 2.5 million million tons of CO2e.
Wow.
So in order to achieve that, and that's 2025, right? We're in 2022, so yes, there's a rush. But to get that done implies an accelerated pace of change, and it implies a really aggressive growth. So I heard, again, someone else, I think it was Shayna earlier, that growth is an intentional sort of scaling strategy. That's part of it.
Absolutely. So we have a few minutes left, and I want to end on something that I used to ask on my podcast everyone. What makes them hopeful right now? You have this incredibly diverse background. You have so much perspective from all of these different sort of places and levers. What actually gives you hope?
I probably would have given you a different answer a year ago, and I think you might have asked me this question a year ago. What's giving me hope right now is what I'm hearing from farmers that I'm talking to. I have met a lot of farmers in the last year, when we finally have been able to go out and travel again, who are excited about trying new things on the farm, who feel confident enough in the market and the consumer interest to take that risk, who feel open to partnering with a weird company like Oatly that, maybe in Iowa they didn't know who we were a few years ago. I think there's a level of entrepreneurialism and a level of, I think, change in the way that young farmers are educated, so that what they're learning to do on the farm looks very, very different maybe than what it did a generation ago. And I am finding that really inspiring.
And I wonder, because this is the Future of Food conference, how does technology figure into what Oatly is doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And honestly, I think we're still figuring it out. We know, for example, that under our regenerative farming framework, we have certain outcomes that we would like to measure quantitatively, and we will need a set of tools to do that. So we've been, looking around at the various sort of traceability tools, using machine learning, using, a lot of the machinery on farms that registers data, some remote data, and then, the sort of, I'm a social scientist, so to me, the farmer survey and conversation also yields really important sort of qualitative data, and putting that all together so that we can track progress.
Absolutely. I also want to talk about what I appreciate about you and about the company is this participatory nature that you have going on with farmers. There's a lot of talking and feedback and talking and feedback. That doesn't happen with a lot of companies.
I mean, I do think it's in the DNA of Oatly, and I love it. I mean, we also do the same kind of conversation with consumers. Like, people know where to find us. And I was at dinner last night, and someone said, oh, I was, fangirling about Oatly, and I said something, and someone wrote me back.
Oh, nice.
And I said, yeah, I think that was either Allie or Paula or Chelsea, because they're 3 actual real people that I work with who will, get back to you. I mean, that's just who we are. That's an easy, I don't want to say easy because it takes work, but that's just an inherent part of who this company is. We want to have honest conversations, and we're also the first people to say, okay, we didn't get it perfect. We're trying. Here's what happened. Here's what went great. Here's what didn't go great, and do people have some ideas for us? So
Absolutely.
We welcome that.
I love the honesty. I love the bluntness. I love the ability to recognize when you've done good and when you haven't done good. And it's a really, again, it's a very special company. I'm biased, but I want to thank you, Julie, for all of your work and being here at South by Southwest. It's been a pleasure to work with you.
Thank you so much. It was so fun to be here.
Take care. Thank you. We're going to get a picture. Thank you.